Anshel, thank you for doing this. Why don't we get started? We have been doing a series of conversations on Zoom for our contributors. I wish we could do more of them, but this is the third to come out of our sixth issue of SAPIR, which is the education issue. And as you can see from what I'm holding on Zoom. So Anshel, thank you so much. You are in London right now covering some sort of event that's taking place there. You're doing so in your role as a roving and distinguished senior correspondent for Haaretz. It's not the only hat that you wear. You are also the Economist's correspondent in Israel. And the most important of your jobs, if I may say, is that you are the author of a feature which we call Jewish Postcards. This time, postcard from wartime Ukraine. You reported this story in Ukraine. Was it in April that you were there?
It was late April, early May, and this was my second visit to Ukraine during the war.
So before we get into the specific subject, which was a really fascinating one, your time with the Jewish community in the eastern city of Dnipro, why don't we talk a little bit about the situation of the war as you've covered it and as it has evolved, particularly in the last very dramatic couple of weeks. We've gone in this war from thinking that the Russians can't be stopped to spending a fair amount of time imagining that it was going to end in a kind of stalemate. And now suddenly this real hope that Ukraine might actually be able to achieve something that looks like a victory of sorts. So do you share that optimism, or what do you think the course of the war is going to be like between now and the beginning of winter?
Well, we're sort of in the fourth phase of this war. This war has been going on now nearly 7 months. So we had the first phase, which was the invasion, where it seemed for a very short moment that Russia was going to go with all its force into Ukraine, and Ukraine would topple and they may capture Kiev and other significant cities. And it really seemed that the first few days, and very few people, some did, but very few people predicted that it would go so badly, so quickly for Russia. But that was the first phase. The second phase was when the world and Russia even realized that this wasn't going to be a quick blitzkrieg type of war, and the Ukrainians were both much more resilient and inventive in their own defense than was expected. They also had some useful help from the West, and perhaps even more so, Russia was much weaker, much more disorganized, much more rotten. We've discovered how rotten from the core the Russian army was. This was kind of the second phase, which ended with the Russians basically saying, actually, we never really intended to capture Kiev. This is all for the Donbass, this is all for fighting in the east. And that was the Russian kind of realignment or reorganization towards the east. Then we had this phase of late spring, early summer, in which Russia began its very gradual, very aggressive, very artillery heavy war of attrition in the east, which was successful to a certain degree. They managed to capture some key areas, mainly in Luhansk, and obviously the destruction and subsequent capture of Mariupol. And now we're in the fourth phase, which is the end of the summer, the counteroffensive, much awaited counteroffensives, which seem to have succeeded much beyond anyone's expectations. Those who haven't been following the last couple of weeks, it began in the south, in the Kherson area, which what seemed to be the main counteroffensive. Turned out that was some kind of a diversion designed to draw the main Russian units down south, while the real push was up in the north in the Kharkiv area, and that's where the Ukrainians have succeeded in capturing thousands of square kilometers and pushing the Russians back in what will probably be learned in military academies for generations to come.
You and I have been friends for 20 years, so I know that in addition to the other hats that you wear, you probably know more about military affairs than 99% of military correspondents, war correspondents, certainly that I have ever met. How realistic are the chances of an abrupt collapse of the entire Russian army, or was what Ukraine was able to achieve in the Northeast not going to be easily replicated elsewhere along this very long front line?
Well, we said remember that we're talking about massive, really massive war zone. It's nothing like what we've seen in this generation. It's larger than Iraq in that sense of in the battlefield that we're dealing here with, and the level of forces that Russia still has are they can't muster the type of fighting units they really need to conduct this war seriously. But they do still have tens of thousands of soldiers there at different levels. They have the local militias of separatists. They're bringing in police units. They're bringing in convicts. They're bringing whatever they can. That's not going to be just swept away, because also the Ukrainians, with all their success in mobilizing and building some very effective new mobile units, what we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks on the Kherson and especially on the Kharkiv front, that's not of a scale that can recapture all that's left of eastern Ukraine, most of Lugansk and most of Donetsk regions in a matter of weeks. What we're seeing is still about 10% of the area which was occupied by Russia. So the remaining 90% is not something that's going to be swept away immediately, but the effect, I think, to Russia's morale, and we're seeing it already in a lot of the propaganda coming out of Moscow, has been shattering, and this could lead to some key development, though it's hard to predict exactly how.
How plausible is the prospect of Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons or other forms of unconventional warfare?
I think that when we're talking about tactical nukes, we're forgetting something very, very basic. They're not held at the unit level. They're held in a small number of central storage or bunker areas deep within Russia. These are areas that are well known to Western intelligence. Satellites are continuously focused on those places, and the warheads haven't been removed from there for decades. I'm not even sure how much technical know-how and what level of operability that any of these warheads have. We know this is the biggest arsenal of tactical nuclear warheads held. It's much bigger than the one the Americans have, but the level of operability, how quickly can it be used, how flexible. I mean, these are supposed to be flexible weapons. They were meant to be used in a flexible way to stop a possible NATO attack on what was then the Warsaw, on then Soviet bloc. I don't really think that the way that you need to use these weapons is at all feasible in this war. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just don't see it happening in this kind of simple way that people are throwing out. Oh well, Putin may use tactical nukes.
Well, it's also the case that the tactical nukes were really introduced not by the Russians so much as by the United States, which needed to compensate for deficient manpower in Europe with and insufficient precision-guided munitions, also before precision-guided munitions really existed, by being able to use weapons that could destroy large amounts of enemy formations, artillery concentrations, and so on, without absolutely decimating the battlefield and rendering it uninhabitable. So it's not even clear what Russia would target with a tactical nuclear weapon, other than to use it as a simple instrument of terror, at which point it effectively becomes a strategic weapon. I want to ask you one more question about current situation in Ukraine before we turn to your essay. And I should say, by the way, as you and I are speaking, I'd like to encourage those of you who are listening. There is a chat function, there is a Q&A function, and as questions occur to you in the course of our conversation, I just ask if you would put them into that Q&A box so that I can get to them in the later side of this conversation. I want to ask you, Anshel, about Israel's policy vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, because Israel was certainly in the early phases of the war, when Naftali Bennett was prime minister, it was somewhat closer to the India's line on Russia than it was with Israel's traditional friends in the West. What do you make of the wisdom of that policy now? And is there any sign that it's changed since Lapid has become interim prime minister? And final point there, what would Netanyahu do if he were to return to his old job?
Well, the policy hasn't really changed over the last 6 months. Here and there, perhaps some rhetorical departures from the line, but in the main, Israel's policy has remained not to take sides, to be supportive of the Ukrainians on a human level, but not on a military level. Bennett originally thought that perhaps he could use the fact that Israel has good relations with both countries also to try and broker some kind of ceasefire. Nothing came out of that. And that hasn't really changed ever since. I think it's not a wise policy, particularly because it's based on, I think, an inflated fear of Russia, certainly when it comes to what Russia can do to Israel on a military level. In Syria, there's this talk. People always saying, well, don't forget we have Russia as a neighbor because they're in Syria. This is a hugely overrated view of the very limited contingent that Russia holds in Syria. Even before the war, this was at the most 20-something fighter jets. Israeli Air Force could have taken them out in 30 minutes if they'd wanted to. And there isn't really much that Russia can do directly against it. It's true that Russia does have and has always had many Jews living in their territory to use as pawns. I'm skeptical about how much Russia could actually use that. Jews don't live in Russia in the same way that they did back in the Tsar's empire. It's not like you've got these villages which you can target with Cossacks and burn them and carry out pogroms. I think that
what significance do you place with Putin closing the Jewish agency in Russia?
That's something that's been going on for a couple of years. It's mainly a bureaucratic tangle that various officials, for various motives, haven't solved until now. It could have been solved quite easy if the Jewish agency had been under serious leadership. It hasn't been. It's been under a temporary chairman for over a year now. Before that, it was Isaac Herzog Bougies. He was the chairman, but he was only using the offices as basically his platform to run a campaign for the presidency. The Jewish agency hasn't been really functioning. It's true that it's a problem for a certain segment of Russian Jews who are trying to leave and make Aliyah, but it's not much more than a bureaucratic issue, which is being used by various politicians right now. But I don't think it's as big a crisis as being made out.
So is there any chance of Israeli, final question, then we'll get to Ukraine, I swear, the Jewish community, there, any chance of Israeli policy changing now that there's a more realistic assessment of Russia's military and other capabilities?
Well, according to Lapid's people, no, they don't. They're not planning any change in policy, certainly in the period between now and the election. And if Netanyahu gets back, let's remember that Netanyahu was someone who actually used photographs of him standing next to Putin, smiling as part of his election campaigns. He wanted to be seen. He wants to be seen, or at least he wanted to be seen as a friend of Putin, just as much as he wanted to be seen as a friend of Donald Trump and Narendra Modi. I don't see Netanyahu changing policy, and I don't think he's going to use the same photographs in this election campaign, but I don't think he's going to do anything to shift on that. And to be fair, Israel's not paying a price for it, not with the West. The West isn't pressuring Israel in any major way, not in the way it's pressured other countries. And funny enough, we're getting to Ukraine now. In Ukraine, you barely hear people, you'll hear sometimes people saying, why doesn't Israel send us Iron Dome and stuff like that? But by and large, Israel is very, very popular in Ukraine. Even now, the Ukrainians see Israel as a model. They don't see themselves as the Palestinians. They see themselves as the Israelis, and they see Russia as the Arabs. That's very much what you hear from Ukrainians from the ground roots up to the highest levels of leadership.
So let's now turn to your trip to Ukraine, your April trip to Ukraine and to this community of Dnipro. And the Jewish relationship with Ukraine has been a fraught one, to say the least, and a tragic one, to say the least, for centuries. It's, I think, a bit surprising to, certainly to a lot of American readers, to discover in reading what you wrote just how rich current Jewish life is, and I mean rich in both a cultural and a financial sense. Current Jewish life in Ukraine is and has remained, and why is that?
So we all have these very strong historic memories, and many of us come from that part of the world. When I drove 3 times from Krakow all the way into central Ukraine and back again, and every time I see, oh, that's a place that this great grandparent came from, and you see them all along the way, all these names that evoke so many memories, both war memories of the kind of rich Jewish life that part of the world between Poland and Ukraine had for so many centuries, and obviously the memories of how it was destroyed, not just in the Holocaust, and also in the Holocaust, there was this large participation of Ukrainian nationalists in rounding up and in killing many Jews, long before Auschwitz was operational in that sense. And even today, you see in places in Western Ukraine, you see those people being commemorated on the road just towards Lviv, or as we would call it, Lvov, back in the day when we all spoke kind of Yiddishy, kind of Ukrainian, Russian, Polish. There's an immaculate little cemetery overlooking the main motorway with lovely white crosses, and it looks like you would think this is a cemetery of some special rich whatever the people who used to rule the country, the upper classes. It turns out that it's an SS Galicia. SS Galicia is a division of Ukrainian volunteers who were in the SS, and they still have their cemetery there overlooking the main road to this day. It's well kept, so it's all still there. And the dichotomy was that Ukrainian nationalism is bad for the Jews, and where the Ukrainian nation becomes an issue, the Jews should get out. And that was also the feeling after the end of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became a sovereign, became an independent nation. For the first few years, even the first decade or so, there were parties within Ukrainian politics who were openly anti-Semitic and who were kind of part of that Petelura Bandera tradition of basically seeing the Jews as the calamity of Ukraine. And at the time, we felt, okay, everyone's leaving. They're either emigrating to Israel or they're emigrating to the US or to Germany. There's not going to be any Jews there. It turns out that many, many Jews remained. Quite a few Jews returned. And there was a reason that they did that, because this became a country with a lot of opportunities, a lot of business opportunities. It became a country where slowly but surely a new generation of leaders regarded anti-Semitism and that type of nationalism as something which wasn't useful for Ukraine. And amongst this leadership, both business leadership and political leadership, there were quite a large number of young Jews. One of them is now the president of the country.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Zelensky, in the sense that how strongly do you feel to what extent is his Jewishness in the foreground of his political persona, or simply, in the deep background, in the way that, say, Joe Biden being a Catholic is not something that a lot of Americans think about one way or another, or is it more present? And has the fact of the war and being accused of being a Nazi regime by the Kremlin turned that into a different kind of asset for Ukrainians?
So it's not part of it. Let's be honest. Zelensky, his daily life doesn't really have much Jewish content, if at all. His kids, according to what is said, they go to the church. His wife's religion isn't quite clear. I mean, I don't want to go into one of these, like, these tables of how Jewish is. Zelensky is Jewish. His parents are Jewish. Everyone knows he's Jewish. And when you talk about religion being in the foreground or in the background, when it comes to being Jewish in what was Russia or the Soviet Union and today Ukraine, if you're Jewish, people know it. Was as a Ukrainian Jewish friend of mine said, "How do you know you're Jewish? Because you or your parents were beat up in school for being Jewish." That's the kind of Jew Zelensky is. It's not something which is part of his daily life, but it's something that he, even if he wanted to, he couldn't shake off. He comes from a family, he comes from a background that everybody knows they're Jews. It's not something he could get away from, even if he wanted to. But it's not a part of his daily life. However, Jews who are very active in the community do take pride in him. They take, and more than take pride in it, they see the fact that he's president as further proof of the change that's happened in Ukraine. And he's the first Jewish president. They've already had a Jewish prime minister. There's a Jewish defense minister right now, and many other prominent Jews in the administration over the last 10, 15 years in Ukraine. And that, I think, is proof of the change that the country has undergone.
So let's talk about Dnipro, because you relate in your piece how 8 years ago, during a previous visit to Dnipro, you were driving in the dead of night through the Ukrainian backcountry. This was when the first war in the Donbass began back in 2014. And you came upon the Menorah Center in Dnipro, and it was something of a total astonishment. What is, just for those who haven't read your piece, what is it? What are they doing, and what role have they been playing in this war?
So it's really important to say a few words about historic Dnipro. Dnipro is a relatively new city. It's a city of industry. It was built up in the 19th century. And unlike other major, and obviously it was part of the Russian Empire at the time, unlike other major Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and others, there were no restrictions on Jews living there. And a certain type of Jew in the 19th century who wanted to get ahead, who wanted to have a profession, who wanted to be successful, this was a very attractive destination. They didn't see themselves as being Ukrainian Jews, they saw them as being Russian Jews. But this very quickly became a city with a heavy Jewish presence already in the late 19th century. And that's remained the case ever since, even though the Nazis, even though the Third Reich captured Dnipro because it was a center of industry. Most of the population was evacuated in advance to the Urals. This was something done, by the way, by Brezhnev, and this was one of the things that made one of the major successes that propelled his career and eventually made him leader of the Soviet Union. And this was always a major Jewish city, even though in the Jewish traditions of Russia and the Pale settlement, it doesn't feature heavily because there are no famous rabbis who came there. It's not an ancient community like.
Well, there's one very famous rabbi who comes from there, but
there are very few people know, besides people who actually live there or people who are really steep in the history of that rabbi's movement. We're talking obviously about Menachem Mendel Schneerson and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who spent his teens there, and his father wasn't the Rebbe, his uncle was the Rebbe, but his father, who was the Rebbe, the father of the Rebbe, was the rabbi of Dnipro in the 1920s and early 30s until basically the Soviets shut down. He was the rabbi of the last shul there, basically. So this in late 19th and early 20th century Jewish Russia and Soviet, this was a very important Jewish center. And as a result of that, the number of Jews still there at the end of the Soviet era was quite large, and those who were prominent in the various industries. As we know, at the end of the Soviet era, the beginning of the post-Soviet era, we had many, let's call them clever business people getting hold of certain...
Also known as oligarchs.
Also known as oligarchs. We're talking about the Ukrainian version of the oligarchs, who are not that different than their Russian cousins, getting hold of factories, of entire industries. And two of those gentlemen, two of those Ukrainian oligarchs, one called Bogolubov, the other one called Kolomoisky, both feature in the top 10, probably in the top 5 billionaires in Ukraine, happened to be Jewish, happened to be from Dnipro. And for them, it meant a lot to build what is the biggest Jewish cult, the biggest JCC in the world. I always ask people, what's the biggest JCC in the world? They think New York, LA, perhaps Paris or somewhere in Israel. No, it's in Dnipro. And the Menorah Center, which was built basically by Bogolubov and Kolomoisky, is a massive complex in the center of Dnipro, which includes a number of shuls, it includes a yeshiva, it includes a whole mall of kosher shops and restaurants. It's got a 5-star business hotel, some more modest hostels, it's got a college in, it's got a number of schools and kindergartens, it's got a small hospital, anything you could basically want to put in a Jewish community center.
This is a building that's, just so people understand, this is a building that's what, 24 stories high, and
it's 3 towers. It's basically putting a finger up on the skyline and saying, we're here, we've survived the Germans, we've survived the communists, we've survived the Ukrainian nationalists, and we're still here. And this is still a town with a significant Jewish community which plans on remaining here.
And it's a community that has really been organized and run and led by Chabad. Is that right?
Yeah. So the few old remaining members of that old community in Dnipro in the late 80s sent the Lubavitcher Rebbe a letter saying, your father's seat is once again available. We can reopen synagogues in Dnipro, and we're inviting you to come back. And this is the myth they say. Obviously, by then the Lubavitcher Rebbe was himself a very old man, and at the end of his days. But he sent at that time, at the very end of the Soviet era, the glasnost, perestroika, any moment communism is falling. He sent 2 shlichim, 2 emissaries to what was still the Soviet Union. One to Moscow, the famous Baron Lazar, who became, as we call him, Putin's rabbi, as a story to himself. And the other one, Kamenetsky, the rabbi of Dnipro. And he said to Kamenetsky, this is my town. You're going to my town to reopen Jewish life there. And basically Kamenetsky, as we see in many places, is this kind of enterprising young Lubavitch rabbi who comes with nothing. The advice he got from the Rebbe was, what are the best seasons to buy potatoes to store away so you'll have food for the rest of the year? But as they do, the successful ones, at least the successful Chabad Shlichim, they find out very quickly who are the sources of power, who are the main movers and shakers, who's got the money in town, and they work out with them a system. And here Kamenetsky has built, together with his oligarch supporters and also many other members of the community, what is an empire. He's basically built 2 parallel education systems. There's a smaller set of schools from kindergarten up to high school for the more religious, for the Chabad people themselves, and there's a much larger Jewish education scene, which isn't that religious. Most people who send their kids there are not observant. Some of them are not fully Jewish. Some of the families mixed Jewish. They have these resources. They've built there, and when you go around Dnipro, you understand how, because you see how Dnipro is it's a boom town. It's one of those towns where you're constantly seeing new buildings being built, and if you go with someone who knows the community, say, this building is being built by this guy from the community, this mall is by another Jewish business person. It's very much a place where Jews are part of the fabric of certainly the business community, There are lots of different assessments of how many Jews there really live there. Kamenetsky said, it told me, and other people who in the community say they believe that 10% people who identify as Jews in the nearly million people living in Dnipro, and they think around 30% with some kind of Jewish roots, which makes it one of the biggest Jewish communities in Europe.
So one question that I have is I mean, it's remarkable, but how sustainable is it? And obviously a lot hinges on the future of the war, but I wanted to get a sense of how sustainable it is, but also your view on whether Jews ought to be setting up shop, so to speak, in these areas that have been, in the long run, typically tragic for the Jewish community worldwide.
Well, I'll start with the second question, and this is a philosophy that I've developed over 25 years of reporting from Jewish communities all over the world, and it's not my or yours. It's not our business to question why Jews live in a place. I mean, Jews live in all kinds of weird places like New York. I mean, it's not something that I would advise.
Even Scarsdale.
I mean, it's something I would advise other Jews to do. I certainly wouldn't want my children going to these places, but it's not my business to tell Jews where to live. If Jews think that they have a future in Dnipro, I'm not going to question that. Now, when we talk about sustainability, the biggest threat in the last 30 years to Jews in Dnipro, I mean, I'm not going back as far as communism. I mean, after communism and Nazism, they've survived that. The biggest threat in the last 30 years to Jews in Dnipro is Israel. Not in a bad way, but the fact is that Israel is there, it's available. They've all been to Israel. I did not meet one Jew in Dnipro who hadn't visited Israel multiple times. And many of them spent enough time in order to get citizenship and to study there and to learn Hebrew, and then came back for various reasons to Dnipro. And you know what? When you see what they have there, it's not something which is it's not a totally outlandish choice to at least to live part of your life in Dnipro. The sustainability has nothing to do with the war. The war the question is, will Ukraine be sustainable altogether? If Ukraine is sustainable, the Jews of Dnipro will flourish. If Ukraine wins this war, if Ukraine comes out of this war, certainly if it comes out of this war bolstered as part of the Western world, perhaps joining the European Union or joining NATO, and certainly being much more aligned with the West than it was with Russia, then certainly this could be one of the most flourishing Jewish communities of the diaspora. And in many ways, it already is. If Ukraine I mean, it doesn't look like right now Ukraine is on the up, but if Ukraine goes down in this war, and if it ends badly, it'll end badly for the Jews as well. And this is really the fascinating historic thing that's happened here. If in the past, certainly in the early 20th century, Ukrainian nationalism was seen as a bad thing for Jews, and the flourishing of Ukrainian nationalism was literally a direct existential threat to Jews living in parts of Ukraine. Now it's the opposite. Jews being more inclined towards the West, being more inclined to open societies, to commerce, to communication, to everything that we see as part of living in the West, and looking at the model that Putin has built in the last 20 odd years in Russia, it's very clear to them what side of the equation they're on. And that's why, and you see that not just in the Dnipro, you see that in other parts of Ukraine as well, with the Jews who've remained. And you also meet a lot of Jews in this war who say, I could escape, I could go to Israel, I could go to the US, I could just go somewhere and shelter for the meanwhile. I'm still staying. Sometimes it's for very pragmatic reasons. I've got a business, things have been good for me here, I can be part of this. And this is something which we really wouldn't have imagined 20 years ago, when Ukraine was still the bad old Ukraine, even though there were pogroms, but it was still, my very first visit to Kiev was 16 years ago, and someone took me to an old but very large cemetery on the outskirts of Kiev, where the child who was killed or murdered, who knows by who, in the Bielski case, the very last blood libel of Europe, the grave is still there. And someone comes every day and cleans the grave, and if it's been snowing, brushes the snow off the grave and lays fresh flowers there. This was 16 years ago. I don't know if it's still the case, but there was still a cult around these. Obviously, Ukrainians are still believed in their having been, in the Jews having murdered this young child whose name I can't remember right now. But Ukraine is no longer in that place. Doesn't mean that you won't still hear sort of archaic words being used to describe Jews, but it's no longer the case where Jews are persecuted or seen as a bad element in Ukraine. They're seen as being the cream of society. Israel is seen as one of the most desirable allies for Ukraine, and in general, people are really proud to say that they're Jewish. And I saw that in parts of Ukraine where I was really surprised in rural areas. If I was traveling with a Jewish colleague or a Jewish driver or translator, them saying it very openly that they're Jewish and it being treated both as a normal and even as an admirable thing. So I think it's very easy, obviously, to become complacent about these things. But at least where Ukraine is right now, Jews feel a quite treasured part of the society.
Let me turn to audience questions. So I will reserve Jeff Saperstein's question for later because it's not about Ukraine. Let's see. So here's a very topical question. Emil Handelsman asks, what factors produced the shift in Ukraine from an ethnic nationalism a century ago to a civic multi-ethnic nationalism today?
I think that the basic rule is that democracy is good for Jews. Jews, for certain short periods, have prospered, perhaps under dictators, under authoritarian leaders, if a specific leader had an interest or a liking for the Jews. We saw that until recently under Putin as well. But by and large, there's a reason why 90-odd% of the Jewish population in the world lives today, either in Israel or in Western democracies. That's where we're secure. And as Ukraine tried to go out of the post-Soviet era and away from the Russian orbit, and to a lesser degree, it's still happening, trying to get away from the corruption of the post-Soviet era. That as they try to build a new type of population, then the obvious thing would be also for the attitude towards the Jews to change. And I think that's it's very natural that this has happened.
Wanda Mazzo says, I keep thinking that those same anti-Semitic people are still living in Ukraine. How to overlook that as a Jew living in Dnipro? So
it's exactly the question I asked Kamenetsky and others there. And their answer is basically this. Every country has national heroes and these national legends and myths and so on. Sadly, the historic national heroes of Ukraine also were people who were anti-Semites and in some cases were also led pogroms. That is a part of history we can't change. What we can do is try and change the present and the future in Ukraine. And hopefully the new national heroes will not be that kind of person. And as far as they're concerned, that's happening now. The new national heroes are not those people who 2 or 3 generations or more ago took part in pogroms and in killing Jews. So they're not closing their eyes to history, but they're still trying to work out a way in which they can live with their non-Jewish neighbors and still be part of a new society.
Alison Cipriani has a pointed question for you, Anshel. Is not Mr. Pfeffer's allegiance with Meretz and Haaretz, does that not slant your views on issues? Few have voiced opposition with Bennett's stance of keeping things calm with Russia. Yes, our jets might knock out their jets, but then what? Then what? Not a smart position for Israel. So how do you justify such a suggestion?
I have had a number of conversations with Bennett over the last few months, and I think obviously I can't say details of off-record conversations, but this is not a simple decision for him or for any other Israeli leader, and they're erring. I think they're erring on the side of caution, and I can understand they're erring on the side of caution. as a journalist, and not necessarily as an Areds journalist, or as a merits voter, but many of my right-wing journalist colleagues as well, where we can and should be critical of this position. And I'm not sure that Israel's doing itself that many favors right now in kind of remaining neutral in this. Some people can disagree, but it's not necessarily a right-wing, left-wing argument either.
Let me push you a little bit on that, because I'm curious. So if Israel were to help the Ukrainians beyond merely humanitarian assistance, field hospitals, medicines, that kind of thing, how could Israel really move the needle and meaningfully assist the Ukrainian war effort? What would be Israel's lane there? That things that Israel could do that perhaps some of the other allied powers have not been able to do?
I don't think that Israel could necessarily be a game changer. Iron Dome, even though it was talking about that the Ukrainians want Iron Dome so much, is not the right kind of missile defense system. For Ukraine, Iron Dome is built to protect relatively small areas, not the kind of vast expanses we're talking about in Ukraine. For Iron Dome to be effective in Ukraine, you would need about 30 batteries. That's twice the number of batteries ever manufactured for Iron Dome. Perhaps, if someone would pay for manufacturing 30 batteries, maybe in 5 years they could be ready. So it's not really the efficient kind of weapons. And there are other Israeli weapons which could be useful to Ukraine, but none of them are game changers. Now there are things that Israel can do for Ukraine on the intelligence sharing side, and who knows, maybe they are happening, because that's not something that we can see on the ground like weapons. But it would be part of the ongoing effort, which is being done by many Western countries, and we can assume that some of the information that Israel shares with its Western allies finds its way to Ukraine as well. But let's look at another example. Let's look at Turkey. Turkey is a country which has sold basically supplied Ukraine with their drones, and still Putin is kind of he's doing nice with Erdogan. He hasn't created a crisis with Turkey, because he needs Turkey when it comes to all the exports, or the Russian exports, going through the Black Sea. So he can't basically criticize Turkey for supplying drones to Ukraine. If Israel were to supply weapons to Ukraine, which would help Ukraine, it wouldn't be a game changer. The Russians would huff and puff, but at the end of the day, Israel has the Russians by a quite vulnerable spot, because if Israel wants to take away from Putin the one big geopolitical achievement he's had in the last 10 years, and that is propping up the Assad regime, Israel could take out Assad very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why Israel has been operating freely in Syrian airspace against Iranian targets over the last 10 years. Isn't because the Russians allow Israel to operate. It's because the Russians recognize that the most powerful military power in that area and over Syria isn't them, it's Israel. And it's Israel allowing Russia to operate in Syria, not the other way around. And the Russians, who understand force very well, know that. So I think that Israel could certainly pressure Russia in Syria. But once again, that is not the main asset that Putin is after. So it would be a nuisance for Russia. It wouldn't be a game changer for Ukraine, I think.
Just on that point, and before I turn to another of the audience questions, is there something worth reading into the fact that Russia is now relying on Iranian drones to shore up its combat capabilities in Ukraine?
Well, they're not relying on them because they haven't yet got them in the field, or they're starting to get them in the field. It's still very much early operation and capability. They haven't really been trained properly how to use them. They're not relying on them. They're beginning to be seen on the battlefield but this is not a period in which Russia's doing at all well on the battlefield. So maybe it will help Russia a bit, but it's not a major capability. Russia's trying to get whatever it can from any source. I mean, they're buying artillery shells from North Korea right now, which probably half of them will blow up within the cannons instead of flying over and hitting a Ukrainian target. We're seeing Russia basically flailing around, trying to bring convicts to the battlefield, trying to bring Iranian drones that they have no preparation how to use. I mean, you don't just assimilate a new type of drone into your army just like that without significant preparation. So far, we've seen Iranian drones falling mainly in Ukraine. We haven't seen them achieving any major targets. The same goes for the way Russia's trying to rely on China. China's not helping them out. What Iran can do for Russia, over time, they can supply them with a certain drone capability, but it will take, I think at least a few months, if not more, for that to have any real impact on the battlefield.
Robert Olesh asks, if you were able to affect America's and the world's policy regarding the Ukraine-Russia war, what would be changed?
Well, I think that what we should have seen, and perhaps now it's slightly less urgent, but I still think it should be done, is we should see a NATO task force. This doesn't necessarily be officially NATO, but I think we should see a naval task force in the Black Sea, securing the shipping routes, making sure that Ukraine's main export, which is agricultural grain and oil and sunflower oil and so on, have a safe passage out there, because that is really where the Russians can choke the Ukrainian economy. And at the end of the day, this is also a battle between economies.
Well, what about the supply of F-16s or longer range missiles that the Biden administration has been reluctant so far to give the Ukrainians? I mean, I guess the larger question is, what are we going for in Ukraine? A stalemate that feels like a moral defeat for Putin, or the actual return to the lines of February 24th, if not to the lines before 2014?
I think first on a tactical level, I'm not quite sure how many F-16s the Ukrainian Air Force could field immediately and what impact they would have. They would have more impact than a bunch of Iranian drones. Would that totally turn around the war overnight? I'm slightly skeptical. It's not that the Russians lack anti-aircraft missiles. Yes, it would help push them back. It would change some of the situation in the air, but this is not very much an air battle. So, I mean, there is a certain capacity also that the Ukrainian military needs to develop to be able to absorb more types of weapons, and this also takes time. So I'm not certain that a certain specific, I mean, the HIMARS was the right weapon at the right time to kind of change the equation when it came to artillery, especially at the point where it seemed that the Russians were managing to slightly roll over the Ukrainians in the east due to their artillery advantage, and the HIMARS was a way of changing that equation. But as it comes to the end goals, the real question is what's going to happen within Russia. We don't want to see a Putin's Russia, but America's learned that it can't appoint a different kind of government in much smaller, weaker countries than Russia. So we're not going to get the kind of government we want to see in Russia anytime soon. We obviously have to give Ukraine the tools to defend itself, to make sure that it doesn't, it's not under threat from Russia again. And that is, I think, not so much necessarily giving F-16, but have a steady supply of training, of ammunition, of all the things it needs to keep their army going, and at the very least to roll back, to push back the Russians to the border. But beyond that, I don't think it's realistic to set an end goal beyond that.
An anonymous attendee asks, right now, the American Jewish community is supporting Jewish life in Russia, as well as those Russian Jews who want to leave. At what point should we stop the former and only focus on the latter? It's a good question.
Well, like I said before, I think we have to both help Jews who want to emigrate from wherever they want to emigrate. We have to recognize that some Jews will live in places which to us seem totally inhospitable to Jews. There still is a not insignificant Jewish community in Iran who could leave, and they've chosen for various reasons to remain. We could think that they're totally deluded, but they still are living in Tehran and Isfahan, and they still have shuls and Jewish lives. It's certainly not the paradise that the Iranian propaganda shows it to be, but it is there, and they're still there to some degree by choice. And the same thing is true of Russia. We should support Jewish life wherever it exists, and we should support Jewish immigration wherever there's a desire of Jews to leave. I don't think it's a question that we should. I don't think it's something that any Jew should say to a fellow Jew, "You've got to leave, and if you don't leave, I'm not going to help you."
So final question comes from Jeff Saperstein and has absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine, but has to do with something that is probably somewhere in the back of the minds of every single person on this call. Will Israel attack the Fordo site or other nuclear sites? And what is the red line that would trigger that move?
The problem with that question is that if the red line is crossed, then it's too late. And it probably is, as far as Israel's concerned, too late at this point, because the level of force that you need to bring to a site like Fordo, and it's not just Fordo, we know that there are a number of sites that need to be taken out if Israel or any attacker wants to significantly degrade Iran's nuclear capability. The level of fire, call it firepower, level of the amount of bunker busting bombs and sorties of it. And we've had this conversation before, you and I, Brett, we've tried to game what would be needed in bombers, in tankers, in ammunition, and so on. Israel, for all the wonders of the Israeli Air Force, doesn't have quite that level. So I think the question is irrelevant at this point. There's only one country that, if it chooses to take out Iran's nuclear capability, can do that, and that's the United States. And I don't think either of us see that happening under any administration, to be honest.
I thought you were going to say Luxembourg, but I guess.
Well, they're a special case. They have some weapons that no one else has.
But is that so? More seriously, is that are we moving inexorably to a world of mutually assured destruction between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran? And an ancillary question: was Benjamin Netanyahu fatally remiss in not sufficiently funding the IDF so that it could accomplish the mission if it was tasked to do so?
So I think that we're at the point where we have to look at all the levers possible to keep Iran on the threshold, before the threshold, because that's basically where it is now. And Iran can decide if it wants to get to the threshold. We just have to make sure, we have to try and use all the possible levers that there are. And then it's not just military, and it's not just sanctions. There are many other things that Israel and the other countries involved can do to try and make it clear to the Iranians it's not worth their while. We're not here to talk about Iran, so we're not going to go into it. When it comes to Netanyahu, was he remiss? Netanyahu was remiss basically in assuming that because mistakenly he thought that the Trump administration would go along with whatever Iran policy Israel said. Therefore, Israel doesn't really need to prepare. It didn't need to prepare a plan B for the day that Donald Trump left the JCPOA. And you and I were not big fans of the JCPOA. I still think it was a mistake at the time, and in the way that it was done to withdraw from it in May 2018. He didn't prepare a plan for that. He didn't put the IDF on some type of, I wouldn't call it war footing, but certainly on a higher level of preparation for some kind of operation in that thing. He assumed, and I don't know on the basis of what, that either the new American sanctions would do the trick, or that the Trump administration would attack Iran at some point.
Is Benjamin Netanyahu going to be the next prime minister of Israel?
I'd say he's got about 60% chance of getting back in office, but not better than that.
Anshel, on that note, I want to be respectful of the time that our very attentive audience has given us. I want to thank you for being such a superb contributor to SAPIR. Merits voter though you might be, when I started SAPIR, I agreed with our publishers and friends at the Maimonides Fund that we would be a publication that would include a wide variety of voices, religiously as well as ideologically. And we're doing our best to honor that commitment. And
I think you should say that I'm not your merits voter. I'm your yeshiva graduate.
You are that. You are that as well. You're a man of many kippot. So I hope you have a good time in London covering the reign of Charles III. And I look forward to seeing you in Israel when I'm there in a few weeks' time. So thank you again for participating, and we will see all of you at the next SAPIR Zoom, if not hopefully in person. Thanks again.
God save the king.
God save the king.